At the end of the 19th century, when the map of the world had already been carved up by empires, one land at the southern tip of Africa refused to yield. Here, a strange war erupted. The mighty British Empire, the most powerful on earth, with its fleet and modern army, found itself challenged by simple farmers on horseback, armed with hunting rifles and an unshakable faith. And to the shock of the world, these farmers would bring the empire to its knees. They were called the Boers, the Dutch word for farmers. Their ancestors were European settlers, Dutch, German, French, who had arrived in the Cape in the 17th century. When Britain gradually took control of the region, many Boers trekked northward, leaving behind the coast to found their own independent republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. To them, they were not just farmers. They were a chosen people, bound by faith, prepared to live and for their freedom. For years, the Boer republics lived in relative isolation. But then, everything changed. Vast goldfields were discovered in the Transvaal. In a matter of years, tens of thousands of British settlers, miners, and investors poured into the land. For the empire, gold was the lifeblood of industry. The thought of this wealth lying in the hands of stubborn farmers was intolerable. Tensions escalated, and war became inevitable. On October 11, 1890, and war was declared. The British believed it would be nothing more than a quick campaign, a few weeks at most, to crush these so-called backward farmers. But in the opening battles, a shocking truth emerged. The Boers were deadly marksmen. Riding fast horses, wielding German Mauser rifles, they struck with precision from long range. They moved like the Mongol cavalry that had terrorized Europe. But instead of raining arrows, they now fired accurate rifle volleys. This made the Boers much more fearsome. The world watched in disbelief, the greatest empire on earth, humbled by men in worn-out boots and wide-brimmed hats. In those first months, the Boers did not just resist, they triumphed. Towns were besieged, British pride shattered. London now realized this would not be a short war. This would be a struggle written in blood and fire. The Boers were no ordinary farmers. They were hardened frontiersmen, raised on horseback, hunting since childhood. Armed with modern Mauser rifles and lightning-fast horses, they turned the rugged South African landscape into their fortress. The British, on the other hand, brought the pride of empire. Tens of thousands of men marching in polished boots with cannons and machine guns. To London, it seemed unthinkable that a few thousand settlers could stand in their way. But the Boers had a very different plan. They didn't fight in neat formations. They struck from the shadows, disappeared into the veld, and reappeared where the British least expected. To the British soldiers, it was like chasing ghosts. Ghosts, with very accurate aim. And so the mighty British Empire found itself humiliated in the first clashes. The hunters had become the hunted. By late 1809, the war took a new shape. The Boers no longer just ambushed columns in the veld, they surrounded entire British towns. Ladysmith, Kimberley, Mafeking. Inside, tens of thousands of British troops and civilians were trapped, cut off from supplies, living on half rations. Outside, the Boers dug trenches and waited patiently. For London, this was a nightmare. The world was watching. The British Empire, ruler of the seas, was being held hostage in dusty little towns by a few thousand farmers. In Kimberley, the mines that had once produced diamonds now became shelters against Boer shells. In Ladysmith, artillery thundered day and night. And in Mafeking, the British press turned the siege into a legend. The longer the sieges dragged on, the more the empire's pride was bruised. This wasn't just war anymore. It was a duel of patience and propaganda. And as the new century dawned, the British Empire decided it had had enough of humiliation. Reinforcements were on the way. Soon the war would escalate into something far bloodier. The British thought the war was won in 1900, but they were wrong. Instead of surrender, the Boers vanished into the veldt and returned as shadows on horseback. They struck at railways, ambushed patrols, and melted away before the British could respond. Frustrated, the empire unleashed a brutal answer: scorched earth, mass deportations, and the infamous concentration camps. Women and children suffered while the world watched in horror. Yet even under such cruelty, the Boers fought on. Their guerrilla war tested British might, drained imperial resources, and stained the reputation of the world's largest empire. This is the story of defiance, desperation, and survival, the dark middle chapter of the Boer War. By early 19th, the British Empire had been humbled. The Boers, farmers turned fighters, had humiliated one of the most powerful armies on earth. But Britain was not about to accept defeat from a few thousand settlers. London reacted with fury. Politicians thundered in Parliament that this insult to the empire would not stand. The call went out across Britain's global dominions, and the response was staggering. Soldiers poured in from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and India, alongside tens of thousands from the British Isles. In just a few months, Britain swelled its presence in South Africa to over 400,000 troops, the largest overseas army it had ever assembled. Imagine that, from Hong Kong to Halifax, from Sydney to Scotland, the empire gathered its sons to fight in the dusty veldt of South Africa. This was no longer a colonial skirmish. It had become a full-scale war between a global superpower and a stubborn local resistance. The strategy was simple: overwhelm the Boers with sheer numbers, crush their strongholds, and end the rebellion quickly. The British war machine moved in waves, columns of infantry, cavalry patrols, and endless supply wagons stretching for miles. Railroads were seized and extended, bridges repaired, and telegraph lines reconnected. Britain was determined to impose its industrial might on a rural guerrilla force. But the Boers were not about to surrender. As the British columns advanced, the commandos melted away, avoiding open battle. They struck at supply lines, derailed trains, and then vanished into the hills. To the frustration of British generals, the enemy seemed everywhere, and nowhere at the same time. Still, the momentum was shifting. In the major cities, Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Bloemfontein, the Union Jack was soon flying. The British could claim that the republics were conquered, but in reality, the war was entering a far more brutal and unpredictable stage. This was no longer a war of armies, it was becoming a war of endurance. When the British Army captured the Boer capitals, London celebrated. Newspapers declared the war was as good as won. But on the ground in South Africa, things looked very different. The Boer fighters had no intention of laying down their rifles. Instead, they abandoned the cities and regrouped in the open veldt, fighting in small, mobile units known as commandos. And here's the twist. The Boer farmers, proved to be some of the best guerrilla fighters of their age. They were born in the saddle, could ride for days with little food, and most importantly, were dead-eye shots. With their Mauser rifles, they could pick off British soldiers from distances that shocked the regular army. They struck like ghosts. A commando of 100 riders would swoop down on an isolated garrison, overwhelm it with lightning speed, seize weapons and supplies, and then disappear before reinforcements arrived. British troops often found themselves fighting shadows. Even more humiliating, trains, symbols of British industrial might, became targets. Boer commandos derailed them, looted their cargo, and left wreckage smoldering in the sun. The image of a mighty empire being harassed by ragtag farmers became a global sensation. One British officer wrote bitterly, "We march all day to catch the enemy, but they vanish like smoke. Yet at night they descend upon our camps with deadly accuracy." For the Boers, it was not about glorious victories. It was about survival. Every successful raid, every destroyed railway line bought them time. Time to keep fighting, time to keep their independence alive, even as the empire threw hundreds of thousands of men against them. But there was a price. Families left behind suffered as British forces began to adopt harsher measures. The war was no longer about set-piece battles. It had become a grim contest of willpower, guerrillas against an empire. The British Empire was growing frustrated. For every victory they claimed, the Boer commandos simply melted into the veldt and struck again. It was like trying to catch the wind. So the British changed tactics. If they could not defeat the Boer fighters directly, they would destroy the world that sustained them. Villages suspected of aiding the commandos were burned to the ground. Farms, once the lifeblood of Boer families, were torched, their crops destroyed, their livestock slaughtered. This scorched earth policy aimed to starve the guerrillas into submission. But perhaps the darkest chapter came with the creation of concentration camps. Tens of thousands of Boer civilians, mostly women and children, were rounded up and placed in makeshift camps. Conditions were dire. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and disease swept through the camps. By the end of the war, more than 26,000 Boer civilians had perished in these camps. Shockingly, even African civilians, often overlooked in many histories, were confined as well, with tens of thousands dying in similar camps. For Britain, a self-proclaimed beacon of civilization, this was a stain on its global reputation. Reports of the suffering leaked back to Europe and America, sparking outrage. Humanitarian voices like Emily Hobhouse raised the alarm, describing the camps as a hell on earth. And yet, the strategy was effective. Stripped of food, shelter, and family support, the Boer fighters grew increasingly desperate. The empire had turned the war into one of attrition, wearing down both body and spirit. The guerrilla fighters still rode bravely, still struck with deadly precision. But now, each bullet fired came at the cost of immense civilian suffering. The British had shown the world that they could crush rebellion, but at a price so high it left scars that would never fully heal. By 1902, the Boer resistance was exhausted. For 3 long years, they had fought against one of the world's most powerful empires, riding across the veldt, striking from the shadows, and refusing to give in. But now, their world was in ruins. Farms were ashes, families were broken, and thousands languished in British camps. The scorched earth had done its work. Even the most hardened Boer commanders knew the fight could not last forever. They were patriots, not fanatics. What use was freedom if their people starved? And so, negotiations began. On May 31, 1902, the Treaty of Vereeniging was signed. The Boers agreed to lay down their arms and accept British sovereignty. Yet the treaty was not pure humiliation. The British, aware of the international criticism, made certain concessions. They promised to rebuild farms, to offer financial aid, and, crucially, to grant the Boers a measure of self-government in the future. For many Boers, it was a bitter pill to swallow. They had not been defeated on the battlefield in a single decisive clash. Instead, they had been worn down, their families targeted, their homes destroyed. Still, the spirit of defiance lived on. Boer leaders like Louis Botha and Jan Smuts would later rise as political figures, guiding the path of South Africa in the decades ahead. The war had ended, but its legacy was complicated. Britain had won, but at the cost of its moral standing. The Boers had lost, but they preserved their identity and, in time, reclaimed political power within South Africa. The Boer War was more than just a colonial conflict. It was a clash of ideals: empire versus independence, modern armies versus guerrilla tactics, power versus resilience. And though the guns fell silent in 1902, the echoes of the war would ripple through the 20th century, shaping not only South Africa's destiny, but also the very image of the British Empire. Thank you for respecting history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and write the bell so you don't miss any battles.